The Media Institute, the foremost independent advocate for the First Amendment for over 4 decades, is one of the nation's leading nonpartisan organizations focused on media and communications policy. The Media Institute promotes freedom of speech, recognizes excellence in journalism, and encourages a competitive media environment and communications industry. Considering the current state of affairs in the nation's capital and across the country, our mission has never been more relevant. And now the President and CEO of the Media Institute, Rick Kapler.
Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to our October virtual Communications Forum Luncheon. Thank you for joining us today. And a special thank you to our luncheon sponsors who make this series possible. We appreciate your support this year, and we need your support next year as well. Let me ask you to please include this luncheon series in your 2021 budget. We're counting on each one of you, our sponsors. Thank you. Our next virtual luncheon will take place on November 23rd and will feature Pat LaPlatney, President and co-CEO of Gray Television. Pat will tell us about the latest developments involving Gray, which owns and operates stations in 94 television markets. That's November 23rd. Then on December 15th, we'll close out our 2020 season with a presentation by FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. I don't have to tell you that that's bound to be a most interesting and highly anticipated event. So please mark your calendar for Chairman Pai on December 15th. As most of you know, we held our Free Speech America Gala in virtual format on October 14th. It was a very successful event, and we really appreciate the support of our gala sponsors. The theme of the evening was A Voice for Everyone, and we honored David Cohen of Comcast and former FCC Acting Chair Mignon Clyburn for their work in promoting diversity and closing the digital divide. Our speaker today embodies those same principles, and like our gala awardees, has devoted much of her career to ensuring a voice for everyone. Dr. Nicole Turner Lee is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, where she serves as director of the Brookings Center for Technology Innovation. She is also co-editor-in-chief of the Brookings online publication, Tech Tank. Dr. Turner Lee came to Brookings from the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council, where she served as vice president and chief research and policy officer. Prior to that, Dr. Lee was vice president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies and the first director of their Media and Technology Institute. Dr. Turner Lee's most recent publications address biases in machine learning algorithms, the digital divide, 5G mobile infrastructure, and telehealth. She's written extensively on the digital divide in both urban and rural areas and the availability of local health resources through telemedicine. She has a new book on the topic coming out next year titled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Dr. Lee graduated from Colgate University, magna cum laude, and has a master's and PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. In addition to other academic appointments, she serves on the FCC's Broadband Advisory Working Group and Digital Diversity Working Group. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to present our most distinguished guest, Dr. Nicole Turner Lee.
Thank you so much, Rick. And I'm just so honored and privileged to be here today to be part of this fabulous luncheon series. In particular, I'm excited because I know many of you that may be chiming in today. It's fair to say, Rick, that first and foremost, I need to thank Will Johnson for recommending me to speak. And I would say to the others who have watched me, this organization has been one that I'm a fan of. Dick Wiley, who's had a presence in my personal career since coming to DC, you know, I just hold him in high esteem, as well as many of you who somewhere along the line actually touched my career or was part of the experiences that I've had so far. Now, I know many of you often hear me speak, so it was very challenging. And I told Rick, I actually wrote notes to make sure that I stay on point, because there's just so much you all know that I want to talk about when it comes to the digital divide. And in particular, I get this opportunity for those of you that have not kept in touch to talk a little bit about what I'm working on at Brookings, and in particular about this forthcoming book that will be out in 2021 about the US digital divide. And I'm really excited about this book for a variety of reasons. The first being that this pandemic has given me so much content that I don't know where to start. But I do know what's so important about this book for many of us that are here on this call, and this honoring of champions like David and Mignon Clyburn with regards to digital access, that this is a problem that started before the pandemic, and hopefully, as we somehow get out of this, that we'll have solutions going forward. Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass is the forthcoming book by Brookings Press, available in 2021. So allow me in these few moments before we go to Q&A to give you some insight into where I am with the digital divide, and to allow us to actually explore what I think are some policy recommendations going forward. So I promise not to keep you too long. As you all know, I'm like a Black Baptist preacher that I'll keep talking until you kick me off the stage. But I will say that these issues are so important that I'm glad to be in the company of the Media Institute to talk about them. It's no secret that prior to the pandemic, that we had a number in the range of about 18 to 20 million people that were offline. And it's no secret that prior to this pandemic, that we knew that they were offline. They were primarily people who were disproportionately people of color. They were the elderly, the rural residents of America, the disabled, as well as people who were low income and English learners. And that chunk of people have been people who have been on the wrong side of digital opportunity for quite some time. They were those folks that in my early years at One Economy, a national nonprofit, were trying to be connected within the confines of their home to do private transactions. They are now the 50 million plus school-age children who sit within the comfort of their living rooms, and if they don't have one, sometimes on the stoops of schools, libraries, and Taco Bells, trying to access virtual education in a meaningful way. These folks that we're talking about that were subjected to the digital divide are now in a space where analog no longer exists. Being connected in 2020 mattered, and it still matters as we go into 2021 and beyond. What we learned in this pandemic, and I know many of you represent companies who provided exceptional goodwill to keeping people connected, that the priorities around digital access that normally were around 10th or 12th on the list have now become closely correlated with those issues that are number one and number two. Let me share what I mean by that. The systemic inequalities that we've actually experienced in these last 7 months, that really we've actually come to know better because they've been broadcasted in ways through our smart devices or seen on public television. These types of systemic inequalities, whether it's the lack of housing, the lack of food, the lack of educational opportunity, really are resonating with many of us, including myself, making our concerns around the digital divide very pressing. And let me go back in history on this. And this is stuff that I outline in my book. It used to be that the digital divide was quite binary. Who had access, who didn't, who had a device, who didn't, who had digital literacy training and who did not. But before the pandemic, it was actually much more complicated than what we actually thought, and quite layered. You cannot get in this country a ride sharing service without a credit card or other financial collateral. You cannot rent a hotel, and in some cases actually engage with an employer without being online. My friends, going back to what I said earlier, analog is dead. And when we think about the systemic inequalities of poverty, the systemic insecurities that come with food and housing, and now the other pandemic of racial inequity, we are at a state where the digital divide matters more than it ever did before. And the appeal to all of us as policymakers is to get out of our own way in how we've spoken about the digital divide that for years has resonated as something that is important, but not necessarily affecting the life chances and outcomes for people of color. Let's think about this for just a moment. We know, for example, at the onset of the pandemic, 50 million public school students were sent home. And those public school students, 15 to 16 million of them, either lacked a home broadband connection or a device. Combined, about 9 million didn't have either. The majority of those young people were students of color. And what we know now from a McKinsey report is that 10.3 months of learning loss will occur among African-American students and more than a year among low-income students if they do not get online. We also know that telehealth has become increasingly important as communities of color are faced with the fact that their high susceptibility to COVID-19 makes it unlikely that they could go into a hospital or to a health practitioner without the likelihood of getting the disease. I heard a very startling statistic the other day about young children of color, African American versus Latina, have higher than 50% susceptibility to COVID if their parents have it. And so, as one Alabama superintendent mentioned to me, in communities where virtual is the only option, or there are choices between in-person and virtual, many parents of color want to go virtual because of the fear of spreading COVID, but they can't because in their communities, like rural Alabama, they do not have access or the infrastructure needed to sustain connectivity. My friends, this pressing concern is complemented, I believe, by something that many of us also think about, and that is the mining of our data and what that means in terms of where we go around the digital divide. So whereas the digital divide was primarily focused upon whether or not you had access or not, or what I'm suggesting, much more multi-layered and complicated because it ties into your essentially your ability to be banked or unbanked, we now know that data has become the new fuel for this digital economy. And there is a new set of players called platform companies that come in and use that data to potentially micro-target people of color and other vulnerable populations. Think about the fact that we have all been home for 7 months and what that means in terms of the types of activities that we've engaged in. We now have people who know more about our choices of movies, who have been able to position machine learning algorithms to give us more of that content. We now have computers that are making decisions, or algorithmic models in AI that are going to create things like heat maps within schools to determine whether or not a child is susceptible to the illness or has a fever. And we now know that we're going to have to be careful about the use of that data, particularly when we look at public health surveillance. Whereas contact tracing and intent is excellent as an alternative to quell the virus without a vaccination, we also have to be sure that the privacy of the individual data submitted is protected. We know that from the companies that are participating in this, that it's de-anonymized. But what about the bad actors that exist? And those are the same bad actors that contribute to the type of misinformation and disinformation, creating these false truths that unfortunately affect communities of color and generate differential treatment or disparate impact when it comes to decisions around employment, financial services or credit, as well as housing and other major issues. This digital divide, which is one of the reasons why I actually titled the book Digitally Invisible versus Digitally Stuck, is that I think that we've done what my idol as a sociologist, Michael Harrington, actually described in his book, The Other America, that we've actually built a segment of society whose life chances and well-being will be quelled if we cannot figure out how to get them online, or if their lack of data quells or stifles the type of innovation that will help us solve some of the very hard problems that we are facing in society today. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a pessimist when it comes to tech. In fact, I wrote about the fact that wireless technologies and mobile devices were what actually surfaced and exposed the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that George Floyd had a knee lodged into his neck. And those platforms that I'm discussing actually share that information to really quell and to start to really bring the energy around Black Lives Matters and other social movements that are now saying enough is enough. But in this space of technological advancement and innovation, we must remember the digitally invisible. In my tour of those 7 cities, and later I will actually show you some of the faces of the digital divide, it got me thinking about why for 20 plus years have I personally been involved in this, as well as many of you. And how is it that a pandemic could actually exacerbate the type of systemic inequalities where having access to online connectivity matters so much that it actually moves the needle in terms of one's social mobility as well as their life chances. We're here, my friends, because we have these unsettled policy debates that continue to sort of haunt our ability to move forward. Now, granted, I think I'm speaking to the choir when we actually suggest that the Communications Act was not based on what we know of the internet today. And granted, we do have grandfathered in the fact that we like to have some of the same discussions around several policy issues that we just can't let go. I admit I'm part of that crowd within the DC area. But I would like to put out just a couple of areas which I think if we started to pay more attention to them, and some of you have heard me speak about this, that we might actually make some progress. And not necessarily closing the divide, because we won't at this juncture close all of the disparities that exist in other areas, but we'll at least have some idea of what we need to do to address some of these inequalities that are paired with digital access. First and foremost, I would like to suggest that we need to go back to the drawing board on universal service reform. There's been a lot of conversation that is now equating, and I'm one of those people who is doing it, broadband insecurity to things like food and housing insecurities. The very fact that we have achievement gaps that are going to affect the nation's K through 12 students, or we have these missed opportunities of essential workers or low-wage workers to be able to work at home. I heard this really interesting anecdote just the other day about parents using their children's Chromebooks from school or tablets or other devices just to check in with their employer, or multiple siblings in the house, as Pew has told us, in low-income households where they're sharing one device, particularly in districts that are not resourced for this type of activity. We need to go back to the drawing board on universal service reform. And maybe the question that we should be asking ourselves is, have we done enough to modernize this outdated program that rests upon formulas that may not be as effective and formulas that push return on investment versus trying to figure out how we make broadband access and digital access as important as one's access to public welfare programs? Let me tell you what I mean by that. We have been in this state, and for 7 months, I'm not going to tell you this, but I will just wholeheartedly, I'm exhausted talking to thousands of school districts across the country who all are faced with the same challenge. How will we pay for what we're supposed to do to ensure that we don't have any equity issues among our students? And what I would suggest that we've done as a country is failed in universal service to make it directly available in these types and cases of need. Not having universal service of broadband within the budget of the National Treasury has made this quite difficult for those actors that are trying to actually migrate online, both at the organizational government level, as well as for individuals. So let me go a little further in what I mean. Having formulas based on return on investment just don't work. And we need to figure out a way to migrate money in the National Treasury, in our budget in the United States of America, to demonstrate that having access matters. It's not necessarily number one, but it is definitely 1A. When we start to talk about healthcare or employment or education, broadband access is critical to the delivery of those services. And the more that we alienate broadband in an environment that has become much more consolidated, where the level of actors is actually pushing it where it's not even sustainable in terms of where we are in universal service today, we will find ourselves in another type of pandemic situation where we're going to have teachers and administrators and workers trying to fight for limited dollars to get access. Why is it, my friends, that we have not spoken about this? And one area that I would suggest under universal service reform is not only do we have to change the formula-based model. I'm not suggesting that universal service in and of itself is inefficiently run. I want to be clear about that. But we might need to think about adding more actors to the table. I know it's not going to be something that many of you want to hear, but we have several actors who have become dependent upon the internet ecosystem to deliver services and run their businesses. Why is it that we're not seeing, for example, platform companies pay into universal service? Of course, they were not envisioned at the onset of this mechanism, but now with the traffic and the value and the beneficiaries that we need to be connected to be able to take advantage of the savings and the efficiencies that are created through internet access, just a portion of the ad revenue provided to platform companies could immediately expand the Universal Service Fund overnight. I think it's also important, B, under universal service reform, that we think about how we're allocating monies in individual access to broadband. We now have a state that since 1986, we've not changed the amount of money that is provided as a subsidy to individuals. And I don't know about you, but I tell my kids all the time that when I was a kid, and I'm not going to tell my age, that getting a candy in the candy store was about 5 cents. Today, buying a candy bar in one of your major supermarkets is a lot more. You get my gist in terms of rethinking perhaps not just the subsidy, but why is it, and I'm thinking about what President Obama did with healthcare.gov, that we're not forming the appropriate partnerships. And I know I'm going to say a bad word based on some of the news that was received today and discussed at the FCC meeting, but I want us to think about what does it mean to zero rate content that could be used for employment and educational purposes for people who are everyday citizens who worry not just about the cost of service, but the cost of data to be able to be given the type of universal service that is innovative and advanced. In my travels as part of my book, I ran across a lot of people who were day laborers. And one of the things that they suggested oftentimes was that at the middle of the month, their phone would shut off. Now, I know we could have another conversation on whether or not rates for broadband internet are fair, whether or not we're dealing with electrification like we've done in the past. But for that 1 or 2 or 3 individuals that I met, the key thing was they were not able to search for jobs because of the limitations of their internet. And in some cases, they had a lifeline program subsidy, but they needed more data. I have been thinking about, and I talk about this in the book, why is it that in America, we don't zero rate access to .govs? Why is it in America that we can offer people Netflix and Spotify to have some differentiation between companies, but we're not thinking about the goodwill of ensuring that government websites are available to every human being across this country? I've spoken to engineers, and the minimal bandwidth that it would take to revolutionize communities would be immeasurable. And I would say for this talk, 3, in terms of universal service reform, that we need to update the E-rate program to bring home broadband access to young students, particularly those in our public schools. Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel and I have been talking about this concept of no child left offline, that essentially looks at ways to modernize E-rate so that we can get this right going forward, because obviously we're going to have cases where kids have to be sent home, but we also recognize that funding is needed to make these investments work. Pretty soon, we're going to come up against an expiration date of December 31st, where states and city governments will have their benefits expire. What happens to the payment of those Wi-Fi hotspots? Who's going to be responsible for ensuring that young people have access to technology to complement their learning, particularly if schools are still either in all virtual or hybrid models? My friends, we need to start thinking big in terms of universal service reform, and potentially start thinking in ways that actually allow us to be pragmatic and practical and accelerating technologies to individuals. Yes, I commend what the current commission is doing in terms of 5G technologies and ensuring that we can get it to spaces. But this brings me to my second point, and I promise I'll close with just 3 and shut up so Rick can ask some questions and all of you. We keep talking about rural and urban divides, and we really need to be talking about rural and urban solutions. I'm working on a project, hopefully soon, that will share not just the rural divide that exists in commonly white communities, but the rural divide that exists among the Black Mississippi Delta residents, or in cases in the deep South of Louisiana, or in parts of Texas or Arizona among immigrants or tribal lands. We have to start thinking about how do we transition these conversations from divides to solutions? What technology could work should be agnostic in how we actually distribute funds to a variety of actors to make sure they get people connected. I had the opportunity to visit Garrett County as part of my book. They're using TV white spaces. And one of the people that you will soon see in my slides are people like farmers who need some type of access to order equipment. My friends, we have the same needs across the board, but honestly, a lot of why we're stuck is because we need the data, whether it's data that exists nationally as to where services and coverage exist, or if it's what I've been suggesting to school districts, having locally available data to know what that looks like when it overlays census tracts. How can a school district know what my children's school is needing if we don't have that information readily available? How do we know that we're putting these wholesale solutions to rural broadband connectivity, but yet the reach that we're making is not solving the systemic inequality and isolation happening in the Black Belt of many of these southern states? My friends, we need to think radically and push harder for the type of data that is going to allow us to make sound economic decisions and also share the mosaic of where we need to get people connected. Pretty soon, I'll be releasing a technology New Deal plan that will begin to not only push for more data, but also suggest that in that push to get people connected, that this is not unlike the American Recovery Act of a few years ago. We are now at a state where a new deal for broadband and technology must consist of infrastructure, workforce development opportunities, as well as our ability to understand the economic indirect and direct benefits coming from networks. I know I've said a lot, and I know I could talk, Rick, so I'm not going to go too much further. But I want people who are listening to understand that unless we begin to look at the digital divide, specifically around those policy proposals that in many respects, perhaps we can control going forward, it's essential that we prioritize universal service reform as well as getting the data necessary to ensure that we're not just building out ubiquitous networks, but we're also making them inclusive and equitable. And that speaks, I think, to the variety of technology policy issues that we need to really embrace and take forward. Now, I don't have enough time to talk about the algorithmic discrimination work that I do and the fact that we need to address algorithmic amplification and this effort to actually ensure that we are delivering data in ways that is also fair without judgment or without necessarily excluding people from opportunity. We've got enough of that so far. But I would suggest my last point, and I told you I'm like a Black Baptist preacher. My church, my pastor only has 3 points, and I'm gonna end with this one. As we think about our space and policy, we need to go back and remember the people. We've spent a lot of time within now the 4 walls of Zoom or WebEx or whatever platform you use. I'm sitting right now within a triangular space in my basement, talking and pontificating about the power of technology. But yet we often don't know who it is that's being affected. We've spent these last 7 months understanding the faces of COVID, but who are the faces of the digital divide? And if you indulge me for just a moment, I want to share who some of those people are. In this tour, for many of you who know me, humbled me, and it gave me the opportunity to reflect on why I've been doing this for 25 plus years. And it also gave me the energy to recognize that prior to this pandemic, we had a problem. And coming out of this pandemic, we have the opportunity to take the goodwill of industry, the wise conviction of the progressive community, as well as the market intelligence of other actors and think tanks to try to get this right. We all need a seat at the table. This is no longer something that can be handled by one agency over the other. So I'm going to tee up some of those faces for you. And I want you to follow me for just a moment as I get ready to wrap up so that you can see how important it is for communities to become less invisible and to surface their visibility in ways that harness the potential and power of these United States of America. The first person I want to introduce you to is farmer John Yoder, who I think is a pretty interesting guy. John Yoder has a farm in Garrett County, Maryland. And on his farm, John Yoder has basically told me during the interview that before white spaces came into fruition, he could see his last mile access from the sense of the end of his farm. And I, of course, being very enthusiastic about artificial intelligence, said to him, well, can't you, how excited are you to actually do precision agriculture? And John Yoder, who's a third generation farmer, essentially said, I'm excited about the potential of technology, but yet I need to order equipment and supplies. Right now, I need to drive into town to our other institutions to be able to do that. My friends, he is a farmer, a small farmer, whose real estate has declined and decreased based on where we have been in the farming industry. And he is somebody who I consider digitally invisible, someone who doesn't normally sit among the likes of folks that have been marginalized historically, but he is close if he doesn't have access. And that's what I thought was so beautiful. If you are interested in his story, you can go to my Brookings website where I actually talk about my experience in Garrett County, and we'll talk about that in my book. And then there are these two unusual ladies, Janice Fleming, the woman in the blue, and Ellen Katz. Ellen worked for the governor. She was drawn to my attention by a mutual friend who shared how important it was to get access in Hartford, Connecticut. Less than 5 miles outside of the capital, they were actually, or not out of the city, they were actually having challenges in connecting families. In fact, she was one of the first people a couple years ago to tell me about African-American girls who were walking to McDonald's doing their homework. And Ellen found allyship in Janice Fleming, an environmental activist who also has taken broadband connectivity under her wing as an issue she wants to solve. In their schools, they're already 50% vacant in low-income neighborhoods. And a lot of that has to do with the declining property base that exists within Black communities. But yet these two together, and Ellen has since moved on, and Janice just recently participated on an NPR interview with me, they're working hard to ensure that there's connectivity in their community. Then there's Mike Woosley. He is the principal of the Pendergast Elementary School in West Phoenix, Arizona. Some of you may be familiar with this place. It's Maricopa County, where immigrants, even when they were legally here, were basically picked up and deported by the sheriff, who has now not been displaced out of office. In this elementary school, 90% of the students had cell phones. And I was kind of surprised by that until the principal told me that they carry cell phones in case a parent actually is picked up by the police so that the kids know what to do next. Could you imagine living in the 21st century where that technology, as I said earlier, enables your power, but is also one, because many of those kids do not have broadband at home, they're also very reluctant to take advantage of low-income programs because they don't want to reveal the identity. What was so wonderful about this school is they were a Connect Ed beneficiary, one-to-one tablet situation. But at the same token, this principal said it was about getting his young people to thrive and not just survive in this new digital age. And then there's my friend. She's become my friend. She's probably one of the most enthusiastic, even more energetic than I am, which I know some of you find hard to believe, Dr. Kathy Trimble. She is the principal of Francis Marion School in Marion, Alabama, the home place or the birthplace of Coretta Scott King. I'm not a rural girl, so it took me a little bit of time to get there. I have to admit that I made my trip in the morning because I've just never been to the rural South. But what I found so wonderful about her, because she was also a Connect Ed beneficiary, is if you look at this photo, she's looking at a kid's smartphone as hi-fiing her kids out of the school. Francis Marion Elementary School is a consolidated school of K through 12 students. There's 700 students in that school based on some poor performance within that district. But this principal, who saw her young people sit on the stoops of her school during the weekends or during off times when kids had internet searching or sat with their parents to be able to find jobs outside of Marion, whose economy has deteriorated. She felt it as a champion to do something different. And because of her, more kids have connectivity, despite it still being hard in this pandemic, because she's not figured out how to ensure a 12-month connectivity solution for her students. And that brings me to this last photo, which is just me and the kids. When I think about the work that I'm talking about and the policy decisions that we have to make, I think about those young people from Marion from West Phoenix, the senior citizens I met in Syracuse, the families in Hartford, the places that I traveled to in DC, and pretty much all over the country. People have asked me, come see us, come see us. I can't, I got my own kids, I can't see everybody, right? But what I've seen in these faces of the digital divide are these next generation young people who in Marion, Alabama, because of the closure of several big factories, will either have to move to Selma or stay at home and be affected by the systemic inequalities I've discussed. We must do better. We must do better. And you all know how to find me. I just put that up there in case I haven't seen you in a while and you're trying to figure out where I'm at. But what I would like to say in closing is that this digital divide is now a really pressing issue. And I do believe, in addition to the policy position statements that I've made today, that it should allow us for a reset that really lets policymakers know that first and foremost, it's not just the ISPs and the platforms that are technology companies. It's the banks and the retail establishments and now the grocery stores. And that if we are going to be transitioning from a digitally invisible state to one that actually begs for competitive experiences for our citizens, in addition to New Deal opportunities going forward, it's important that we pay attention and we understand that we have more work to do for those who have been given the least. My friends, as we await the results of the next election, and as we think about even our own trials and tribulations, I'm a parent and I have a 13-year-old who's sitting upstairs and I have no idea what she's doing right now because I'm here. This new digital normal is the new carve out for what society is. And I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say this. We as policymakers have the opportunity to bring the type of face and humanity to those challenges and issues that we have tried to address. And it's been, thankfully, the resiliency of your networks, of those of you who work for ISPs, and the creativeness of your platforms that have led to, I think, one part of the equation. But if we dismiss the fact that we still have more work to do to ensure equitable, ubiquitous, and inclusive networks and content and policies that are related to that, that ensure that this equity is not just lip service, I would suggest to you that you remember those faces and you remember them in ways that drives the energy that gets me up every day at Brookings to keep fighting for those who require the type of digital justice that we need to allot today. So everything that I spoke about is available on the Brookings website, as well as my own personal website, Dr. Nicole Speaks. And if you want to hear more of me and what we're doing at the Center for Technology Innovation in my new role as director, I would encourage you to follow along our podcast, Tech Tank, which is correlated with our newsletter that addresses these and many more issues. So Rick, thank you for allowing me to capture this audience. I'm so humbled based on my utmost respect for the work of the Media Institute and all of the people who in some way touched my career along the way.
Well, thank you, Nicole. What a wonderful presentation, and just very fascinating. And I love the way you brought the slides to show, to put faces and to put real people to these policy issues, which sometimes can become very abstract. Just seeing the people that are affected and what their lives are like really added a whole nother dimension to your talk. So thank you. Thank you for all these good points that you raised. I want to ask our audience, we have a chat feature on your screen, so please feel free to use that and ask questions as we go along here. And I just want to start by asking you, Nicole, when you were talking about universal service and the need to modernize it, you said that formulas based on return on investment don't work anymore. So what would you see as an alternative to that?
That's why it's so interesting. When I was writing this chapter for my book, I went and interviewed people who are familiar with this universal service. I went to USAC and just sort of asked generic questions on how the fund is run. I did all my research. In fact, I pulled out information that I had from 2002 and 2003 when we were actually talking about universal service. And I think what we have seen is, the fact that we're seeing incrementally based, delivery of the type of reimbursements that happen, it's a delay in getting the money out has been problematic, I think, during this pandemic. Also, the way that the contribution formula is actually arranged, it's very heavily dependent, I think, on an ecosystem that is not necessarily dying. I want everybody to know that, but it's consolidating in ways that they're not the only sheriff in town anymore. And so we've got to think about how do we expand upon the actors. I am in no way suggesting that universal service should have gatekeepers of people who give more or less, because we all know as the formulas and as the fund shrinks in terms of contributors, that gets passed on to consumers. What I'm suggesting is that for years, we've had certain exceptions to who contributes to universal service, in addition to new actors that have entered the marketplace. If we think of this as a serious endeavor, Rick, we would either try to reform universal service to increase the pot, or we would find ways to just bring it to the national budget. Now, some have argued partisanship may limit that. The same type of challenges that we have with food programs and other safety nets would actually be a challenge. But the bottom line is, when I think about all the principals and superintendents and city leaders that I spoke to, they had no way of accessing that money immediately. And so as a result, much of the goodwill that actually came through was through philanthropic, private sector, and maybe individual contributions, with some money being repurposed on other issues through the CARES Act. And I think that we've got to go back and really rethink, what that looks like. And I think looking at the current contribution formula is one way to do it, as well as figuring out who else needs to be added to the ecosystem so that we can sort of modernize it to adjust to what the internet looks like now.
You talked about adding platform companies and having them start to pay into the system. Is that being actively pursued, or have they been approached and asked to contribute, or where does that stand?
Well, not yet, but I want people to buy my book. So I actually talk about it in my book. But I would suggest to anybody listening, I want to entertain this conversation of who needs to be at the table to actually fill out the gaps in terms of universal service. I bring that up, and it's no secret that as we watch the digital ecology shift, and again, for any platform company that's watching, it's not an indictment of you, but we do know in this pandemic that we're moving from brick and mortar to more virtual. That means that there's going to be a lot of demand on these networks to be functional and efficient and resilient. And how do you pay for the affordability of that, particularly in areas where there's less competition? You've got to increase universal service. And so, Rick, it's a pretty provocative proposition. And the way we've laid it out in the book is more so based on what we know of publicly in terms of ad revenue as one starter conversation. But I do think that there has to be a way for the United States, if we're not trying to move towards just plain old government regulated utility oriented internet, which, by the way, I'm not trying to be controversial, but we got to be really careful about suggesting that people who are poor need to get a lack of quality of service. I'm just going to say that, because what my tour actually showed me is that people are concerned about that, right? They want to be able to watch Netflix and surf for jobs. They don't want us to pick and choose what they can do. So I think going forward, Rick, we need to have a thorough conversation around what the digital ecosystem looks like and figure out how we also can be creative to grow that fund so we can provide people who are broadband insecure the type of efficiencies and sustainability they need to stay connected.
Mm-hmm. Good. You also mentioned, Nicole, you talked about the need for data for school districts and overlaying census tract information. Where's that data going to come from? Is there a way to harness that?
Well, it's so funny. I think we're all like keeping our fingers crossed that we'll have some appropriation associated with the new legislation. But I do think it's very interesting. When I was at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, I put out a paper that some of you may remember called Place Matters. And what we did was we tried to overlay at that time the national broadband map where people of color lived, particularly those of low income. And what we found is that their communities were completely passed over. And I think it's important for us, and some organizations have tried to do this. I put out, again, very assertively, that data matters. So with school districts, just real quickly in 10 seconds, a lot of school districts didn't even know who their provider was. And so I've been pushing school districts to ask kids when they enroll them or re-enroll them to update that information, because it matters. It allowed schools and school districts to get better connected to their ISPs or a local provider of fiber that can actually help connect their students.
And here's an interesting question, sort of a historical perspective. What can we learn from other universal service transformations from the last century, such as with electricity?
Well, it's interesting because I get asked that question a lot. So I talk about in the book, the idea that we're pushing even today that, electricity is universal. So why is it that we don't have electricity the way it is today? It's interesting. I think we're dealing with a different dynamic. The levels of investment in terms of this particular utility are very different models than what we saw with electricity. We know we need ubiquitous access, which is why I'm actually suggesting that we begin to think of the internet as a utility of a lot of things. We tend to get focused on what works in electricity that we should transfer to broadband. But as I tell many people, we still have this issue of, do we rate broadband access in terms of per minute? I don't know about you, when I was growing up, when the baby bells were rating long distance, it didn't work for my family, who was of working class means, because it meant a call 4 miles away from me was very expensive. It also goes back to what I've been dealing with. What is it that we expect if we actually make broadband as ubiquitous as electricity? And I don't know, since I've been home, my electricity bill is quite high. And there's been a lot of supportive programs that have been incorporated around electricity to actually help people afford it. So to tell you the truth, since I've written the book, I've been going back and forth on this, and I'm hoping to actually put out something as part of this new deal that actually begins to speak about this, because I think we get locked up as policymakers in old models and discussions that may not necessarily adapt to the internet as we know it today, nor to consumers, which is why I suggested that zero rating of workforce. Everybody has a smartphone in my community, 97% of African Americans and Latinos, but they also may not have a job like I do. So I just always remember President Obama with healthcare.gov, where we had to figure out something creative to tether these communities in ways that actually amplified the benefit versus trying to pick very strict parameters for when you could actually use your access. And that's the same thing I think about government in terms of where we place government in the mix of this all hands on deck debate.
And just a kind of a technical question here. What's an algorithmic amplification?
Yes, and I'm sorry, because that's the other body of work. For those of you who don't know, I spent a lot of time on digital divide and other regulatory legislative issues. And then in my spare time, I find myself talking about machine learning algorithms and equity among that. So for the person who asked that question, algorithmic amplification has become sort of a buzzword. We already know that the world is actually organized by machine learning algorithms that pick up on our micro-targeted traits, attributes, and behaviors. When they're amplified, much of what we're seeing in hate speech or misinformation or disinformation, it means that the algorithm is set in context in ways that people over time believe it. And it can lead to what we talk about now in the public media, deep state, as well as sort of like neural conditioning where people won't vote because of the lack of information or the disinformation that's being attributed. When I speak about algorithmic amplification, I think I speak of it in the ways of technologists, which is the more that the algorithm is attuned to your specific behaviors, attributes, and traits, even when they don't ask if I'm a Black woman, but they know how I purchase, they know how much time I spend on certain things, the more it has the ability to amplify those experiences, leading to some type of predatory outcome. Because the computer basically knows me better than I know myself, and I don't have that opportunity to sort of break out of that, new filter bubble, essentially, to actually curate new experiences. Again, if you go to the Brookings website, we're talking a lot about that. We actually have AI as an initiative, and I run our bias work as part of my role at CTI.
Good. Well, we have time for one more question. So let me just ask a kind of a summary wrap-up question. What, in your estimation, is there one answer or one top priority for closing the digital divide? Or is it just too complex to try and narrow it down and say, this is the first thing we need to do, this is the most important?
Well, I think given the fact that we're coming out soon to the end of an election, I will put it like this. I think that we need to see whatever ticket take this seriously. I think obviously if it's a Biden-Harris ticket, who cares about race, so equity, as well as ubiquitous access to resources, I think they should take this technology New Deal seriously. And I think they should really include in that this revamp of universal service. I guess what I'm saying in two words, digital divide has to be somewhere within the mouths of any type of new legislator. I think Trump, in all honesty, Chairman Pai has actually spoken digital divide several times. I sit on the FCC Diversity Committee, and I know he cares about this. It's something that we focus on. The key thing is, at some point, I think the one word I would say around digital divide, and I will leave it like that because I know I'm wordy, but I had to get there, Rick. I'm a little older than I was. For people who know me, so it takes me a minute to get my thoughts together. But I would say the one word is bipartisanship. As we go into this next administration, next Congress potentially, and if we stay in the same, bipartisanship is the key to what I have found to be any telecommunications or technology policy. Some Dick Wiley taught me. Dick Wiley taught me that early on, partisanship.
Well, you've got a good teacher there, and certainly a key word in a lot of areas, including the digital divide.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Nicole, for an excellent presentation and very enlightening and eye-opening. And we thank you so much for being with us today. It's great to have you join us. Thanks to Dr. Nicole Turner Lee. And again, I want to thank all our sponsors, and special thanks to Dave Arland of Arland Communications and John Taylor of LG Electronics. And we'll see you back here on November 23rd for our virtual communications forum luncheon for November, featuring Pat Platney of Gray Television. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you to our special guest speaker today. Thank you to the Navy Band. And thank you again to our sponsors. See you next month.